And speaking of the rule book and how dense it is, obviously there's some discussion about a recent rule that was more or less rediscovered by everybody. We will discuss that later on in the podcast. But Fabi, a lot of it was sparked because of this no increment situation, because of pieces flying. Um, when illegal moves are being played, what can you do as an arbiter? And Fabi, what do you expect an arbiter to do um, in order to intervene and to smoothen the process of, playing a fair game of chess?
Yeah, so the first thing is my comment wasn't directed at the event, although it was in relation, we were talking about the event, but I don't know what the conditions there are. So I wasn't saying that the arbiters there are necessarily doing a bad job. It had nothing to do with that event. It was a general statement, and I can sort of give some examples. Uh, as we said before, the vast majority of chess games, especially classical chess games, have absolutely no disputes, and usually nothing um, that an arbiter has to resolve in terms of, yeah, the arbiter has many roles, but in terms of classical chess games, and especially at these high level events where we have video footage and where there's not too many games going on, it's not an open tournament. The I mean, I could go the next 2 years without having a single dispute in a classical chess game, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. But I have had a few that I can remember, including in World Championship cycle events. And I think in every single case, it's been mismanaged. And they're all different types of things. It's almost never related to time scrambles. So the first thing that I can mention was that in one candidates event, that spectators were taking photos with phones with flash on. Phones or cameras, I can't quite remember, but there was flash, and it was during a time trouble phase with an arbiter directly standing at our board, and my opponent uh kind of indicating to the arbiter to do something about it and nothing being done. And this was during a time trouble phase, so it's really not on the responsibility of the players to make sure that spectators aren't doing something intrusive, which I think is like one of the main roles of the arbiter in case there are spectators, to make sure that the players aren't disturbed. And this is a candidates event. It's not your local club event where anything can go maybe. One of the other things was a Grand Prix event with something which should have been very simple, because it was a threefold claim that my opponent made and I objected to. And normally it should just be resolved on the computer because the computer shows it. So the arbiters, two of them, both highly experienced international arbiters, check the game on the computer and inform me that it was threefold repetition. And then they tell us to agree to a draw. So we do. And then I recheck my score sheet and find out again what I thought, that there wasn't threefold. So I go to the arbiters again, and then they reverse the result. At this point, it's such a mess, of course, that they made a wrong ruling that I don't even know what they're supposed to do. They reverse the result and the game continues. And luckily, I guess for them, the game was drawn, so my opponent didn't file an appeal, which I don't know how that would have gone either. And there was no like huge conflict because the result of the game um, matched what they had ruled on before. But still, it shows that they couldn't figure out something which is shown on a computer. Um, and those are like my two main things from World Championship cycle events. Uh, like a very common thing which has absolutely no negative effects, you could say, but it kind of speaks to competence in my view, is that very often arbiters don't know where to place the kings to indicate a result on a DGT board, which is, I think, a basic sort of thing to know that you play. It makes me feel like maybe the arbiters don't understand chess very well, or maybe they're not. I don't know. Actually, it seems like a kind of basic requirement that you understand how the DGT board functions. And more recently in the Olympiad, I had like a number of arbiters who were kind of intrusive themselves in terms of crowding around boards and generally being a little bit in the way, which again should be a basic requirement that arbiters don't get in the way themselves. So of course these are very few incidents over decades. So I have been playing for decades, and I can only name a handful of things, let's say, that have been um, either annoying or a little bit that showed a lack of competence. So it's not too many examples, but that I haven't had like a really um, clearly resolved dispute in high level events. Uh, the other issue I have is that a lot of arbiters, and these are again in events that I don't really play in, but a lot of arbiters are complicit in prearranging tournaments, in my understanding of things. Um, Probably not, the tournaments that, uh, let's say, not American events, and probably not very high level events. But there are a lot of stories of certain events, norm events, where organizers and arbiters are complicit in prearranging games and tournaments, which is it's not an issue of competence, but
I feel
it's
this is
it's a pretty
more
serious issue.
related to corruption,
Yeah,
which I think it
but it's also
could
an issue.
affect pretty much everybody from players to organizers to arbiters, sure. But it's
And
mostly
and
corruption.
and again, this has like a little bit in some small cases. I say small as in a few cases, not that they were unimportant, but some few cases have happened where arbiters have tried to prearrange, maybe successfully, or negotiated prearranged results in World Championship cycle events, specifically Grand Prix events. Like this is um, sort of known that this has happened. So again, that's not an issue of competence, but it's probably a more serious issue. And yeah, that speaks to corruption. That's not an arbiter thing, right? That although arbiters are some of
Yeah,
the most guilty parties.
yeah. I can't come on here and defend the arbiters that are doing any of that stuff. I mean that's clearly not related to just arbitering standards. That's just related to just regular chess ethic issues. That organizers, arbiters, and players are sometimes involved in, right? So I yeah, it's I are we including those arbiters in the overall standards of arbiter? That's not part of the skill set. That's just a general human corruption, ethical issues, as you said.
Yeah,
Now, I will
I just
say
want to
that
I just want to clarify. I'm not trying to paint arbiters with the broad brush in terms of that. Like I assume that the vast majority of arbiters have not um, have not done that. Uh, but it is some sort of corruption issue as well. But yeah, I just want to clarify that I would assume that this happens in a tiniest percentage of cases.
Yeah, and again, for players, for arbiters, for coaches, and for organizers as well, corruption is at pretty much every level. Now, Chris, could you address some of the points that Fabi just made? Specifically, perhaps we should talk about the candidates one, where in the heat of the battle, you allow photographers, maybe visitors to take pictures with sound or with
yeah.
flash.
So I mean, what I will say is that so sometimes a lot of these regulations on what is allowed for media, their access, and various things like that is beyond what the organizers are going to check with the arbiters beforehand, right? So if an organizer turns around and says, we want media access for the first 20 minutes, we want them to be able to, use flash photography for that time, we want them to come back in during the once they reach the time control and various things along those lanes, it's the arbiter doesn't get an awful lot of say in what an organizer who's maybe putting up all the money and various things to do that. Now, from my perspective, I know the organizers obviously in places like St. Louis, and I know organizers very well that I will turn around and say, this is probably not the most sensible thing for us to allow to happen. Do you mind if we do it this way and various things? Now, I don't think there's any excuse for an arbiter that allows or deliberately allows something to happen during the game that is going to disturb the players, right? We had the famous case at the candidates with Alireza walking around with the shoes, and that disturbed one of the players. And then the arbiter got sort of vilified for speaking to Alireza while his game was in progress, but while he was away and it wasn't his move, blah, 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 and various things. So, an issue occurred, a problem, that was disturbing players. The Arbiter tried to take care of it and then sort of got shot in the foot by Alariza himself for, trying to take care of it. So we want the playing conditions, or I say we, I'm hoping that the rest of the Arbiter world wants the playing conditions to be the best playing conditions. I don't think there's an excuse for allowing flash photography later on, unless unless the Arbiter didn't know it was happening or whatever. But I would assume that flash photography, or if loud camera clicks or anything, especially in a time scramble, personally, I'll try and mush those people away. But you've also got to understand that, media are allowed, the approved media are allowed access to certain things, and they don't necessarily always have the best equipment for chess events. Sometimes it is a little loud and it does get annoying, and it's hard to bridge that gap of where the line is, what you feel that the players can withstand, and what you feel that you should not allow and get away with. So yeah, I'm not going to defend an Arbiter that allows any sort of disruption, but sometimes you don't give a choice. For instance, at the Hall of Fame, if people start making noise on the second floor of the exhibit, that's out of my hands. I can't do anything to stop that. Yes, I can quickly get on my computer and message the club and say, hey, can you shut them up? But that is not going to stop that disturbance or that noise that sometimes carries and travels up, while they're also trying to run a museum on the lower levels of the Hall of Fame. So sometimes things are just a little out of your hand that you've got to deal with at the time, and try and get the playing conditions back to where you want them. You don't always get to pick and choose when that timing is. For instance, Irina Frush had an issue at the American Cup this year, where I think she was the only game going on. The room was very quiet, but then someone walked into the room from the back security, and she could see that in her field of vision, and that disturbed her. So we eventually, put a policy on that no one's allowed to come in at a certain point during time troubles and things along those lines. But the incident had already happened. It had already disturbed her. She told me after the game. So then we tried to correct it. And I apologize that happened during that game. There's no going back from that point. So sometimes things happen. You've got to deal with them. They're not always things that are in your control. We had the tornado warning during the American Cup. What do you do about that, right? So you can't always, predict what's going to happen to disturb the players. But you can do your very best as an arbiter to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. The draw claim, repetition draw claim, that must be one of the most common instances of arbiter error, right? We're dealing with a draw claim. The laws actually specify that the players themselves should work out whether the repetition is correct or not. Of course, the arbiters usually take that out of their hands, go check on the computer. We run a special claim tool that I've not had any issues with yet, that pops up and tells us which move. That is currently in development to improve that for arbiters and make that better. I don't know if you've seen, if I have an issue where a player doesn't agree with it, I will actually unplug my laptop and take over the computer to them to explain to them why it is or it isn't. And at that point, if I've made a mistake, the player will point that out to me, and then we'll make the ruling that way. I've taken players over to my computer to show them when they haven't agreed with that type of thing. If I don't have something as mobile as a laptop. So there are ways to prevent this. Again, like I said previously, we're human. We make mistakes. We don't want to make mistakes. And of course, the mistakes that are highlighted are the ones that are in the important tournaments like Grand Prix or candidates or various things along those lines. Those are where you don't want to be making mistakes. A lot of the times, hopefully, if you're lucky as an arbiter, you look out and the mistake you made has zero effect on the final outcome of that game. But where it doesn't, this is the whole reason we have an appeals process too. If we didn't make mistakes, we'd never need an appeal process. That hopefully is there to go ahead and correct whatever that mistake was. it's not as good as getting the decision right in the first place, but there is a backup plan that hopefully is in effect to take care of this type of stuff too. So mistakes will happen. Hopefully, you're not reading about me making a mistake anytime soon. But I will tell you as well, I had a good friend, Wayne Clark, who's since passed away, who's a national tournament director and international arbiter. We were dealing with an arbiter who had made a mistake, and they know they'd made a mistake, and they were beating themselves up about it. I'm sure you get this as a coach, Christian, with your players when they make mistakes, and you've got to, talk to them and calm them down. And basically, his response was, all my national tournament director title means is, now I'm at the highest level, is that I've made many more mistakes than you've made until you get to that level. We all made mistakes. We live and learn from those mistakes. Yes, we feel sorry for the players that we made those mistakes in those games in. Sometimes it happens. Like I said, the rule book is enormous and not necessarily are clear on the interpretations on how you're meant to do things. So, sometimes things happen. You don't want them to happen on the biggest stage. But, it does. I can't say it doesn't, but, it does.
And to narrow that down, Fabi, what would you say in your experience as an elite level player? What are the responsibilities, the critical responsibilities of a chess arbiter in your matches, in your cases? Obviously, you cannot be speaking too much about open tournaments and whatnot. You haven't played a lot of those in a while, but what would you say are the most critical responsibilities of an arbiter in closed high-level events?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. First, I just want to say, like, about the media. I understand that this is outside of arbiter's hands. The example I used wasn't a media example because I try to be very understanding of the media pass that there is. And yeah, sometimes camera people do get a bit intrusive, but that is also part of the sport. That was just a spectator taking a photo. It wasn't some approved media. That was back in the days when there was lesser security at 2018, and there was live audience on the balcony as well, and also audience pretty much like a meter or maybe 2 meters away from our board. And I do feel like that was a clear case of like just not in just inaction in a moment when you kind of have a job to do. Okay, and in regards to your question about what the role of an arbiter is, I can also speak in terms of like general tournaments because I do have some memory of open tournaments. It's been a while since I've regularly played opens, but I do still have some memory of them.
And you'll play
in terms of closed tournaments, where we have like, let's say, these Grand Chess Tour events where we have very few players and very few games going on. And in terms of, I think the main thing that the arbiter should have is an attention towards everything that's going on. And when it's 5 boards, then, and especially in classical chess, I think it's quite possible to do that, quite realistic. In terms of rapid and blitz, I don't think it's super realistic to be surveying 5 boards at once. But very often you do have 2 arbiters, and to be more or less have an idea of everything that's going on. Usually the kind of dispute phase will happen in a time trouble phase where there's probably only 1 or 2 games still going on because many of the other games have finished. And then it's quite realistic also to be attentive. And I think you mentioned or asked before about what happens when players start dropping pieces. And I also fully concede that this is mostly a player responsibility to play chess in a collected way and not to be sloppy, even if sometimes it's difficult to make moves neatly. But it's still sort of your responsibility to put pieces where they belong. It's going to be difficult with no increment. That's true. I mean, I've played with no increment on rare occasions over the board, and it's very difficult to place your pieces in an orderly way and not to flag, not to drop pieces. But the reality is that we do see a lot of pieces being dropped. And yeah, Chris, I think that this is more a question to you in terms of what the arbiter's role is in this case. I would say that in general, if I were to make the rules, I would think that an arbiter should intervene as soon as pieces start rolling and then the clock is hit, and to give a warning first to the player who does it, and then maybe a time penalty for the second occasion. But I don't think it seems like, even though it may be entirely in the rules that the arbiter can only intervene once the player complains, I think that just for the spirit of the game, so that pieces aren't rolling and it's not a mess for everyone involved, that the arbiter should, once they see pieces being dropped and the clock being hit, so which is more or less an illegal move, then the arbiter should intervene. That would be my interpretation of it.
Chris, would you like
Yeah,
to
so
address that?
I can, yeah. So yeah, so we've got the laws, and most rapid and blitz games, and I can certainly speak for the Grandchester since I helped write those regulations. They're played under what's known as the inadequate supervision laws. This basically means we don't have like one arbiter per game, one arbiter per X number of games as are recommended to allow us to use the full competition rules. So time scrambles are going to happen in Rapid and Blitz. I think I've said that at various players' meetings, in my announcements before rounds start and various things. Yeah, the players have an obligation to put those pieces on the right squares, make sure that they correct things before they press the clock, and various things along those lines. Now, one of the things that the inadequate supervision laws does state, and especially in terms of an illegal move, um, is that the time that we have to step in to enact a punishment for that illegal move is before the player makes his or her next move. So you can imagine you get down to very few seconds left. If you're watching multiple games at a time, your head is like a tennis umpire, and you're sort of like this watching both games or whatever. So if you have 5 games still that all go down to the wire in a blitz time control, you can't watch everything at once. And then you have that very short amount of time to be able to step in and enact a penalty according to the laws. So the laws understand that these are for situations where you have a lot of games going on and not as many arbiters as you need for one set of eyes per game. For instance, the World Rapid and Blitz Championships that are coming up and previous ones have always been played under these specific laws. So the players also have a complete full right to claim an illegal move, before they make the next move. So do we want arbiters to step in? Yeah, I believe we do. And in the full competition rules that are in use, and we'll get to that later in terms of the Global Chess League, I think the arbiters certainly should step in and correct. I think, as you said, there's a difference between illegal moves and pieces flying everywhere, which might be considered under displaced pieces. Again, this is quite a nuance in the laws. And I think once you start having pieces flying everywhere, I think a lot of arbiters think if they don't step in at that initial moment and deal with it, that all bets are off at that point and it's just a free for all, right? At what stage are you then, if you've let it go for 3, 4, 5 moves and suddenly pieces are flying everywhere and the clock's bashing, at what point are you now going to step in and deal with that? And it's a very tough decision for an arbiter to make. There have been instances where I've seen players make an illegal move. I've started stepping towards that board to go deal with it. The opponent responds, and I can no longer get involved. So, according to the laws, so the laws sort of tie the arbiter's hands in certain situations, which may not always be appreciated by the players who are playing or the people who are watching or what's going on. So yes, I always try and step in when I see an illegal move. I wish my colleagues would all do that. But just because you don't see someone step in doesn't mean that they didn't try to step in. And then they've had their hands tied by the laws as they're written and as we are enacting them. So there's there's a lot of different things going on here. Now, I will say places like St. Louis, and when I'm an arbiter, we're set up much better in that location than say a Grand Chess Tour event that's in Europe, where the arbiters are sort of stationed off the stage and they're not necessarily up on the stage watching what's happening at the end of the game. And because that's also partially because they've been instructed to not get in the way of the cameras, not get in the way of the spectators, not do this, that, and the other. So one thing I will say is that in St. Louis, we're set up much better in the fact that we are able to walk in amongst those games and watch everything that's happening, especially towards time controls, towards the end of the game. Whereas in Grand Chess Tour in Europe, where they're set up with the stage and the arbiters are, sort of told, don't get in the way of the spectators, the view of the players, don't get in the way of the cameras, so sometimes they have a desk off the stage, which is not ideal for watching these, the last few moves. There's nothing better for an arbiter than to be physically up watching. You're the best impartial judges to what happened in a game. I know we've got video replay and access to things along those lines, but what the arbiter sees, you're going to miss a lot of things that are potentially happening when you're not at the game. So, and then by the time you've walked from the edge of the stage to try and get involved in that game, it's 10 moves further on, and that situation has totally gone. So I think arbiters can help themselves when they're setting themselves up for success or being able to handle these situations that come up. I think there's certainly something to be said for getting involved in the setup process of how things are set up and being able to get involved. But yes, I want arbiters to get involved in games. A lot of people don't necessarily see it that way. They want the arbiters to stay out of it. In the US chess rules, the philosophy is completely different. They want the game to be between the two players. Now, this is obviously separate from the FIDE laws, which is much more, if you run in anything that's FIDE rated, you've got to use the FIDE laws. But in the US chess rules set themselves, they don't want you interfering in a game. They want that to be between the two players. So there's a lot of times where you can't even get involved in a game in the US chess world when you want to, because the rules specifically don't allow you to. So, like I said, inaction on the part of an arbiter doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't see it and they didn't try to do something about it. It could just well be that the laws don't allow them to step in because of the specifics of what's going on. It's a blitz, and we're using the inadequate supervision version of the laws.
Yeah, so in regards to your point about inadequate supervision, I think I understand that the rules do get in the way, and it's probably quite a difficult situation, and also things are moving very quickly. But it's rarely one illegal move. So it's not like the arbiter has to step in immediately. And if an arbiter sees that a player is continuing to make illegal moves, they could definitely be prepared to step in, and they could be ready in case another one happens. And usually we see with these games where players start dropping pieces and pressing the clock, and very often they no longer start making moves which are even attempted to be legal. Like they're just moving their hand and then knocking a piece over, pressing the clock, and everything's flying. I think at some point an arbiter should step in and should also be prepared to step in, and probably within the rules they can time it so that they get in. And if both players are making illegal moves, they don't have to penalize one player. They could give a warning or something, but definitely. And also from my experience, like, not just playing events where sometimes things get messy, but also watching events where things get messy. Usually, or very often, an arbiter is there. These very often happen in critical games where there's one game left, for example. Like we can talk about the Global Chess League. It was the like final decisive game of the match. Definitely, if there are arbiters there at all, then they must have been watching the game, right? Or at least they should have been watching the game because there was only one game left, right? So they definitely.
So I don't know if you've seen the setup that they have in the Global Chess League. So the arbiter is sort of behind the cameras. So I mean, it takes a few steps to get there, but again, in terms of Global Chess League, and I think we'll maybe visit some of the issues that happen there. Yeah, they have less excuses because they're not actually using the inadequate supervision version of the laws there. They're using the full competition rules, which basically denies them that sort of get out of jail free card anyway. So, sorry.
Yeah, no,
No, I
and
understand that
go ahead, Fabi.
this is sort of a rule that's written in to perhaps help arbiters who don't really have a way to mediate this during in the heat of the moment. But it also shouldn't be used as a get out of jail free. Like it seems like it's kind of taking responsibility off the arbiters at moments when they're needed because both players have lost control, which is their fault. But regardless of how we got to that point and whose fault it is, you need someone to intervene so that it's not a mess anymore.
Could
And
it
it can
be
also,
could it be the
sorry?
responsibility of players? Sorry to interrupt. Could it be the responsibility of players to claim that, let's say, my opponent is not making legal moves anymore, like either off-center pieces or pieces are just like flying? Should it be the responsibility of players to claim that?
I think so. I also think that once players are in that mode where they're just trying to avoid getting flagged, they're probably not thinking about much else, but they do have that responsibility, I think, to either play in an orderly way or if their opponent's not doing so, then to stop the clock and complain about it. But we rarely see that the case. And the second question is like whose responsibility is it after the players no longer do that? I mean, I think a very famous case from a very important event was the Women's World Cup in 21. This game between Manadze and Videlka, right? Which was an Armageddon game, so you expect perhaps some these are probably the games where you're most likely to see disputes and probably related to either illegal moves or something to do with the clock, right? And since it was the final game of the match and probably one of the last games remaining of that day, and also because there were so many arbiters in the World Cup event, there must have been multiple arbiters standing around and watching as the players allowed pieces to basically fall on the ground, and both of the players. So, although it might be difficult, there has to be a way for the arbiters to do something at some moment in the game. Otherwise, I think it does speak to like some level of uselessness, right? If they have no way to mediate this or to ensure that proper play is happening, then what exactly are they doing there?
Chris, would you care to
Yeah,
can you
again,
respond to that?
I will I will say, ideally, yes, an arbiter steps in, and hopefully we catch the first infraction, right? That's the time to sort of take a breath and step in, and you want to catch that first one and penalize that first one, and then hopefully the players are much more reasonable from that perspective onwards. It's really tough in a no increment game when players are down to barely seconds and things are happening. You like I said, I think at some point the arbiter just makes a determination that listen, the players are clearly just going along with this because as you said, they're in that mindset of I'm playing, I'm playing, I'm playing. I don't have a second to just stop and think and pause the clock and say, hey, this is silly. What's going on here? There's got to be something that can be done about this, because both players are usually you know the ones doing it, and neither one wants to be the one. You can't stop and think to make that claim, I assume. So yeah, I again, I feel an arbiter should step in. You want to try and catch that first infraction, but I think once you get beyond a certain point, I think the arbiter mindset might be, I'm just going to let this play out because I missed that point where I needed to step in. The players are obviously, or not obviously, but they're continuing, and the sort of chess playing will decide the outcome of this game. Yeah, yes, we've seen various silly endings or with things happening that I've gone online and said this is not serious chess. This is not what we should be watching in such prestigious events, not like the World Cup, not not the Global Chess League, not whatever. We've often had Armageddon as a playoff in Grand Chess Tour, US Championships. That's always been part of the playoff structure. I've slowly worked that out, so it's not like it's going to take a long time for us to get to an Armageddon. So we try and fight things as an Arbiter team from that perspective. Of course, the organizers want excitement. They want this. There was the Armageddon series that was in Berlin, right, where it was just purely a lot of those games were a mess. I remember Dominguez and various people having similar games, but they want that. So, if an arbiter stepped in, you might be risking your job as an arbiter stepping in and getting involved in this, because that's actually what the organizer wants to attract viewers and excitement and various things along those lines. So there's a lot that might go through an arbiter's head, when trying to work out, do I actually step in here at the end of this game that's now such a mess that I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to resolve this issue.
But just to clarify, are this type of situations covered in the rulebook of arbiters? Are you guys, whenever you go through training, do you guys have this type of scenarios laid out and asked, okay, what's your decision in this and that case?
Well, I mean, you bring up training, so let's put this out there. There is no formal training for arbiters that happens. Okay, the arbiters become arbiters. In the US chess, you sign a piece of paper to become a club tournament director, and you work your way up the ladder like that. You get training, mentorship at events that you're working at, and as things happen, you might be able to get some sort of education on site and various things from people who are willing to train, and you impart your knowledge to other players, other arbiters that are willing to learn from you. I get a lot of my training from watching bad things happen on the internet that has happened at a tournament, and then we discuss, how would we handle that? What are we meant to do? So, the Arbiters Commission are trying to introduce sort of refreshers, but once every 4 years, and that's just to make sure that arbiters are staying up with the latest laws and various things. Yes, there are in the laws, there are situations that cover what we should do if displaced pieces, illegal moves. It's all in there, but again, we've got the inadequate supervision version of the rapid and blitz laws that on illegal moves, if we don't step in by a certain time, then we let it go. But other than that, we should be everything is covered in the laws. If pieces are going flying, yes, there's a law that covers displaced pieces. We shouldn't be allowing that to happen. We should be stepping in and doing that. Again, it's not always as black and white as you want it to be. It's in the rules. It's in the laws, but getting an arbiter to actually always follow those laws and whatever, and also having the understanding of when you don't necessarily need to get involved because it's not going to affect anything, or it's not going to change anything. Or like one of the things that's been happening a lot recently, I've noticed, and even in the high level events in St. Louis, is players will make a move, and I'm not just necessarily talking about being low on time. They will make a move, they'll press the clock, and then they'll readjust the piece back onto the square where they should have put it properly in the first place. Now that's against, you shouldn't be adjusting the pieces on your opponent's time. So that's against the laws. There's something in the laws that we can do about that. But, a lot of the times, if players both have an hour left, that is not affecting anything. So if an arbiter doesn't step in and correct it at that point, it's probably, no one's ever going to know, no one's ever going to notice. It doesn't affect the player, their opponent, and various things. Now, if they're doing it with a minute left and continuously doing it, like I had to penalize Alice Lee in a recent event because she was doing it constantly. I think it was the Kearns Cup. So I stepped in and awarded the opponent 2 minutes because she you can't continuously keep doing that. That's against the laws. So at some point, you've got to enact and try and correct a behavior that you see is happening. It's not necessarily the worst behavior in the world that's going to affect the result, but at some point you have to step in, and it is against the laws, and deal with it. So, and I wish arbiters would do that. Of course, the most contentious games that are happening are these fast games, the blitz games, where people a very long time. I don't know whether a 1 second increment or a 2 second increment is enough to stop whatever's going on from going on, whether it's enough to stop the pieces flying from wherever they're flying and stuff like that. But, yeah, obviously the arbiters there have sort of set a precedence that they're not going to step in at certain things, sorry, in the Global Chess League, that they're not going to sort of step in and stop all of this madness from going on.